それでは主催者を代表いたしまして、自然エネルギー財団トーマス小比例理事長様より皆様にご挨拶を申し上げます。
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to co-organize this event, and I think this is a significant event in the development. I thought that one would. Sorry. Very welcome to this significant event for the development of renewable energy in Japan. I have my background in Europe, and I have been active in the energy policy development in Sweden, and also on the board of one of the companies that has developed offshore wind power during recent years. Japan certainly has enormous potential in this field. To succeed, we will need a combination of good policies and efficient industrial activities in this area. If we get efficient policies and good industrial development, offshore wind power will provide large amounts of low-cost electricity for Japan, reducing the need for imported energy and making Japan energy rich. The possible success can be illustrated by the rapid development in Northern Europe when offshore wind power investments took off in 2016. In July 2016, it was announced that Danish Dong, now Ørsted, won a competitive contract for electricity from offshore wind power by the Netherlands North Sea coast at a price of just below 73 euros per megawatt hour. And that was then considered tremendously low. 2 months later, Vattenfall won a competitive bidding process outside the Danish west coast, and then the price agreed on was 60 euros per megawatt hour. And already 2 months later, Vattenfall again won a bidding process of the Danish east coast at Kriegers Flak at a price below 50 euros per megawatt hour. So prices were falling by 10 euros per megawatt hour every 2 months. I joked saying that if it went on like that, offshore wind power would be for free the coming summer, which didn't happen. But already in April the following year, April 2017, we had the first contracts in Europe for offshore wind power where the developer said they would be willing to take on and develop offshore wind power without receiving any subsidies, relying only on the income they could earn from selling the electricity in the open market, outcompeting existing power plants. First it was Dong, now Ørsted, and Energie Baden-Württemberg, who won contracts off the German North Sea coast, and later also Vattenfall has won a contract off the Dutch coast, and there are now several processes where offshore wind power projects are offered to developers, but they cannot expect a subsidy. They compete on being big, trustworthy, and delivering a lot of electricity. So in just a few years, thanks to scaling up of the industry, developing larger power plants, higher turbines, better capacity factors, and more efficient use of the special infrastructure, cranes, ships with cranes, and more efficient expected future maintenance because of large-scale offshore wind with professional teams and special vessels to do the operations and maintenance. Costs have fallen to the level where new offshore wind power plants outcompete existing thermal power plants in Northern Europe. And this is at price levels below the Japanese price levels. It's roughly 4 to 6 yen per kilowatt hour in the North European power markets. So these are the opportunities, but as I started off saying, it requires well-designed policies and an industry that quickly learns and adapts to the opportunities that have already been demonstrated in other parts of the world. And I hope that today we will have opportunities to understand the Japanese policy development and also to assess its opportunities to provide safe investment opportunities and the opportunity to scale up this industry so that it can reach low competitive prices. Unlike many other renewable energy technologies, offshore wind power benefit a lot from large-scale deployment. It will require very large investments. It will require development of new infrastructure and engagement of large financial actors as well as industrial companies. But it offers enormous opportunities for Japan. So once again, very welcome to this event. I hope it will be constructive and that we will remember it as one of the starting points of a successful development in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. それでは早速基調講演の第一部を始めさせていただきます。まず最初にブルームバーグ NEF のアジア太平洋地域エネルギー経済の分析リーダーデイビッド・カンより洋上風力欧州からアジアへと題しまして基調講演をいたします。デイビッド、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you very much, Marvin. よろしくお願いします。And I apologize in advance for not being able to speak Japanese. I'll be presenting in English. So thank you for joining the Future of Offshore Wind workshop. Before we get into the exciting world of offshore wind, I'd like to take a brief moment to introduce who we are and what we do. Bloomberg NEF is a group of over 250 experts based in 17 locations around the world, providing in-depth primary research. In the beginning, we focused on clean energy, but we continuously expanded our coverage to across advanced transport, digital industry, commodities, and most recently, to advanced materials. What we do is we provide in-depth analysis of each of this sector, and we also connect the dots between these jointly evolving industries to come up with holistic analysis for businesses and policymakers. And of course, wind technology has always been one of the key sectors of our research. So we have long history tracking wind turbine prices. We also track O&M prices. We look at corporate strategies. We look at policy changes on a global scale to identify new opportunities in the wind sector. Now, let's get into the key topic of this presentation: European learnings and Asian opportunities for offshore wind. Before I begin, I'd like to ask this question: why should we support offshore wind when it's still in many regions one of the most expensive renewable technologies? This is an open question, of course, but we think these are some of the key rationales. First is industrial policy and job creation. Offshore wind industry creates lots of local jobs, and these are high-skilled labors relative to other technologies like solar, where much of the industry has already been automated and therefore create relatively low-skilled labors. Onshore wind also creates lots of high-skilled jobs, but the volume is less concentrated in onshore. Second is large scale and diversification. If we think about diversifying a country's energy mix from the angle of reliability, offshore wind, with its stable generation profile, allows it to serve as a backbone of a country's power system. Third is proximity to large coastal cities. And the fact that Tokyo, one of the biggest demand centers in the world, is located not too far away from one of the potential offshore wind sites like Chiba is a good example of this. Which also links to the fourth rationale, land restriction, which is becoming more and more of a serious issue in countries like Japan and Korea. And offshore wind allows gigawatt scale projects to be developed without sacrificing valuable land and turning into a rather scary landscape like you see in California. But most importantly, the most important reason we should be looking at offshore wind is because the costs have come down so quickly. This is what we call the most important graph in offshore wind today, because it shows how quickly this industry has developed. On the Y chart, you're looking at the price, the bidding price of offshore wind projects. On the X-axis, you're looking at the expected commissioning year of these projects. And you can clearly see the accelerated cost drop that have resulted in the recent zero subsidy bids that is catching news everywhere. And the main driver of this change is a move away from feed-in tariff into auctions. With auctions, we're seeing increased level of competition across the value chain, and this is making offshore wind as a technology more and more cost competitive. Now, when we talk about competition, when we talk about cost in general, it's important to note that we, as BNEF, think about this cost curve for offshore wind as a global cost curve, which means learnings from local market are transferred to other markets. So learnings that we're seeing in European markets, the North Sea market, are now being gradually transferred to Asian markets. As a matter of fact, this red line here, which is what we published quite some time ago, has been remarkably effective in forecasting where the long-term costs will fall in different places around the world. And you can see that this red cost curve falling right in the middle of the recent auction bids that have been announced. But when new markets, when policymakers think about offshore wind, it's important to think about this, is segregate the long-term and mid to short-term approach. In the long term, we believe the cost curve will follow the global LCOE or levelized cost of electricity. But in the mid to short term, it follows two cost curves, not one. The new market curve and the experienced market curve. And it's when a market reaches a critical point, which we think is around 3 to 4 gigawatt mark, that it changes the face and steps down from the new markets curve to the cheap experienced market curve. So what happens is, in most markets, you start to see first projects, testbed projects, demonstration projects. And then developers start gathering into the market, develop their own projects, pushing the boundaries across the value chain. And then governments come into play. They formalize policies, streamline permit processes, and then the market starts to grow experience and establish local supply chain, domestic supply chain. And it's at around this 3 to 4 gigawatt mark where we start to see a clear route to market being established from the developer's point of view. And after that, we start to see streamlined projects, countries moving into a centralized auction system where a lot of the pre-development work, like land acquisition and permit processes, have already been done. And then the final stage, you see projects clustering in a massive scale, driving further cost reduction. So what we try to do is we try to place the key markets in the world on this chart. And it would be interesting to hear from the panelists today on where they see these respective markets stand on the curve. We think India hasn't yet entered the market. Japan and Korea are probably somewhere between developer-led projects and formalizing policies. Mainland China is an interesting case because it's quickly increasing its commissioning experience, but a lot of the projects are not true offshore in the sense that they're located very near from the shore. So they do have an established local supply chain, but now it's about transferring that knowledge to the deeper waters, further away from shore. And then in between the two lines, you see the United States and Taiwan with committed pipeline and capacity to have already seen significant cost drops. And finally, you see Europe firmly on the right side of this curve. And this is where you start to see the zero subsidy bids. So what I'm trying to say from this chart is that many people say low cost curve for offshore wind does not exist in Asia. It's a unicorn. But the main message we're trying to tell is it's not a unicorn, it exists, but it's not free. You have to pay. You have to pay to get on this curve. This brings us to the key question at hand. So what are the learnings from the European markets that can be transferred to Asia markets, and what are not? What are some of the shortcuts that we can take to help Asia markets get on the experience curve faster? And this boils down to really understanding the different types of risks associated with offshore wind projects. What you're seeing in front of you is our view of the severity of risks on the y-axis plotted against how difficult it is to manage that risk. And this includes everything from the technology itself, financing risk like access to capital, permitting and local communities, and even typhoons. I won't go through each and every one of these risks, but what I do want to do is go through the key corners of this chart. And the first one is this one, the top right. The risks that are high and also very difficult to manage, and these are permitting and local community, opposition from local communities. For example, in South Korea market, the country has over 10 gigawatts of permitted or announced project pipeline. But actual commissioning to date, and these 10 gigawatt of projects, they've been announced long time ago. But actual commissioning to date is only over 30 megawatts. And that's primarily because most of these projects face fierce opposition from local communities. And when that happens, even if these projects have obtained permits or even about to begin construction, the whole project goes to a full stop. And then you have risks on the left. They're mostly wind resource risks, site conditions, typhoons that are high in risk but easy to manage. And I'm going to explain why we think this way. They're high in risk because these are the things that are difficult to foresee. They're difficult to forecast. But at the same time, they're easier to manage because it's the question of access to the right data and how much they cost. If you think about risk, there's always a cost-risk balance. Because your project, as a project developer, your return often reflects the level of risk that you have taken. And these are the types of risks that if you pay and if you do enough research, they can be manageable. And then finally, you have technology and construction risks. Technology risk, we think, is actually fairly low, given that it is a tried and tested technology. But construction risk is where it gets tricky. It can really vary between high and medium risk, depending on how much overseas you're willing to bring into the market. For example, if Japan is willing to bring in ships, special ships like jack-up vessels, and experienced contractors from Europe, then this risk is fairly manageable. If local content rule is strongly emphasized, then this quickly becomes a high-risk issue. So we think it's the risks that are plotted generally in this middle part that European experience can greatly help speed up the Asian markets. This brings us to the final part of this presentation, where I'd like to share with you our global and APAC forecast. This is our latest offshore wind forecast of annual deployment in black numbers here in gigawatt terms, plotted onto year 2030. And now if you look at this chart, our takeaway is that this is really an exponential growth story. This chart is screaming opportunity to us. And if you break this chart down to different regions, you can see that APAC has a huge role to play here. If you zoom into that APAC forecast, you can see a lot of the growth is coming from the mainland China market. In China, we expect, based on the projects that are currently under development, we expect around 3 gigawatt of annual additions in 2020s. This is actually overshooting the current Chinese government's 5-year plan. And a lot of that development will happen in Jiangsu, Guangdong, and Fujian province, but we see other regions slowly catching up as well. Again, the challenge in China market is to move away from the current nearshore projects and transfer its local experience of the nearshore projects to a more offshore locations. Adding on to that is Taiwan market, where we already see clear route to market to have been established. There's lots of commissioned projects. There's great wind resource. There's also strong support from the government. And with this route to market, Taiwan is actually a great example that validates our experience curve theory. In last year's auction, when Taiwan passed the 3 gigawatt mark of committed project pipeline, actual bid of projects for target commissioning of mid-2020s plunged in line with our global cost curve expectations. Now let's look at Japan. Japan, although it offers a very high level, relatively high level of feed-in tariff at 36 yen per kilowatt hour, if you remember this chart, if you plot 36 yen, it's the highest one is $200. So Japan's feed-in tariff is literally off the chart. Even with the high feed-in tariff, we've only seen less than 17 megawatt of commissioned capacity, and this is excluding nearshore and demonstration projects. And the main obstacles are stakeholder engagement and grid connection. As many of you know, fishery is a crucial part of income, it's a source of income for many prefectures in Japan. And these prefectures hold the right to define open sea areas for the offshore wind projects, which really complicates the stakeholder engagement. And then there's the grid connection issues. Most offshore projects in Japan struggle to get grid connection because utilities have full control over how much offshore wind capacity gets connected to their grid system. And if there's need for new grid investment, that cost is borne by the project itself, which makes, in some cases, the 36 yen per kilowatt hour not that generous. In order to boost the industry, the Japanese government is planning to launch a new auction system with designated sites. And these are the 7 zones of the designated site that we think can be the candidates based on the announced capacity of actual project pipeline and the level of local community support. And if you look at our estimated capacity factor of these 7 zones that we've chosen, it's interesting to note that the local communities from the best wind resources usually tend to be less supportive of offshore wind. And this is probably because of their past history of conflicts with existing projects that are being developed. So in order to boost the industry, this new auction system, it should have clear advantage over the current FIT system. And what they're doing now is they're going to provide secure rights to use the oceans for the next 30 years, which is great, as opposed to the FIT system where you have to renew the ocean use contract every 3 to 5 years. It also comes with environment data, which includes ocean conditions, seabed conditions, and wind information, etc., which will help save development costs. However, the auction price itself will probably be lower than the FIT price. And also, because these zones come with capacity requirements directly from the government, from the developer's perspective, they have less flexibility to design their wind farm the way they want. And most importantly, these auctions also require the time-consuming environmental impact assessment, the difficult stakeholder engagement, and grid connections, which make the new auction, as it stands today, not that attractive. Japan has more than 5 gigawatt of permitted and commissioned capacities. And given the different challenges that you see from these projects, we see the market taking off from only after 2023. Now, in order to accelerate this growth, in order to push this growth forward, what needs to happen is a well-designed auction system. A well-designed auction system that we've seen in Europe that guarantees EIA, that guarantees permits, and in some cases that guarantees grid connection, speeds up cost reduction in the industry, lowers the project risks, and it invites in more participants to the market. Lastly, South Korea market is also worth noting with over 10 gigawatt of permitted and announced project pipeline. And the government recently increased the subsidy for offshore wind, which makes the 2019 Korea West Sea offshore wind project one of the highest paid projects globally at over $300 per megawatt hour. The challenge in Korea, like Japan, is to overcome the local opposition. And what's happening now in Korea is that developers are now redesigning their project to make it more community inclusive by introducing equity sharing models for their projects and also installing artificial fishing banks around the turbines for fisheries. To summarize, we're seeing slow growth in some markets, but despite of that, we expect going forward about 5 to 6 gigawatts of new additions every year in APAC, and this is clearly a huge opportunity. So in today's panel discussion, it would be interesting to hear how our panelists see the APAC market getting from where we are today, still relatively low installations, into what is eventually a very booming industry. And with that, I thank you very much. ありがとうございます。
デイビッド、ありがとうございました。続きまして、世界風力エネルギー会議のベン・バックウェルより世界に広がる洋上風力と題しまして基調講演をいたします。Mr. バックウェル、よろしくお願いいたします。
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very, very nice to be here in Tokyo, and thank you very much for inviting me here to Bloomberg. I've actually spent the week here at the invitation of the Japan Renewable Energy Institute, and it's been a really fascinating week. I took part in an expert meeting on Tuesday. We had the revision conference on Wednesday, and I've also been touring around the different ministries, talking to officials here about the offshore wind framework as it emerges. And I've also been meeting with our partners here, our local partners, the Japan Wind Power Association that represents the local wind industry. I'm actually from a small island in the North Sea called Britain. Or part of it called England. As I looked at my computer half an hour ago, we were still part of Europe. We may not be by the time I get home again, but let's take UK as part of that Europe category on David's slide, at least for now. We may well find that the world's biggest offshore wind sector is suddenly not in Europe anymore in a couple of weeks' time. It's actually, funnily enough, being here last night, looking at the English newspapers, there's an extremely important announcement was made, which I think is really important for Japan. The wind industry in the UK reached what they call a sector deal with the UK government, and it basically provides for installing, getting to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. It involves creating 27,000 new jobs from offshore wind, a third of which will be jobs for women, So it's really important to see this better gender balance emerging within our industry. And it will provide, by 2030, offshore wind will provide 1/3 of the UK's electricity, which I think is a really impressive number. And it's interesting because this comes right in the middle of the Brexit political issue, which I was alluding to earlier. And it's really interesting because 3 or 4 years ago, the UK was still talking about nuclear and gas and how important it was to have those technologies in our energy mix, and there was quite a lot of division amongst different political parties and political actors. And now the one thing we can agree on is offshore wind. You know, we can't agree on anything else, but we can agree that offshore wind is a good thing. And that's an incredible achievement for the wind industry, and is really a function of what David Kang showed in his slides, that we've gone, and Thomas alluded to, that we went from a very, quite high, expensive industry to something that was extremely competitive, and created a lot of jobs and industrial growth in a very short time. And what was really notable about it was there was a kind of moment where the politicians and the political parties kind of put their hard hats on and started appearing at ports and offshore wind farms, and they kind of realized that there's something good here. You know, we're getting competitive electricity, and we're opening factories, and we're opening new ports, and we're announcing numbers of jobs, and it had a really powerful impact on our political consensus around the wind industry. So I just wanted to very quickly talk about the global market, but very quickly, because I think David has covered quite a lot of it. And then I want to talk about Japan very quickly at the end. And I want to come back to this idea of a sector deal. So this is me. I've written 2 books about the wind industry, and been involved quite a long time as a consultant, and before that as an analyst and a journalist. GWEC represents the global wind industry, big corporations involved, companies involved in wind, developers and OEMs, and also global associations. So all the global associations, including our partners here in Japan, Wind Power Association, which represents the Japanese industry. And we really try and go around and lobby and provide information and research that supports the transition, the journey to wind power. We run an offshore task force, which is made up of some of the leading players in the industry. This is some of them, it's not all of them, there's quite a lot more. And we provide market intelligence, we run workshops, we do policy advocacy, we run events, and we try and spread best practices from what's already happening in the world to countries that are trying to start on this journey and build their offshore wind sectors. We have a global ambassador, who I won't talk about very much because he's sitting over here in the front row, Hendrik Stietsel, who we are very honored to have as our kind of global ambassador and spokesperson. The task force is chaired by Alistair Dutton, who ran the Crown Estate Round 3 process in the UK for the Crown Estate, and then was the offshore wind special advisor for the UK Ministry. And before that, I'd worked as a developer for BP. And one of the things we do is run a kind of readiness assessment, which allows governments to benchmark themselves and in different areas around things like policy and grid and ports and infrastructure and tender systems, and look at the different options they have in these different areas, look at potential bottlenecks, and produce a kind of gap analysis that then points towards the areas that need to be invested in or speeded up. We're slightly less important than the UK sector deal. We were very happy to announce yesterday a new cooperation agreement with the World Bank International Finance Corporation, which will involve us really working together over the next 3 or 4 years to try and take offshore wind to a whole bunch of new markets. I'm not talking about the ones that David Kang mentioned. I'm talking about places like Vietnam and Indonesia and the Philippines and South Africa, because the wind resource in a lot of those places for offshore is phenomenal. So we will be running a series of government workshops and other activities over the next couple of years with the World Bank to try and help that and to create an investment flow as well into offshore wind from these multilaterals. Why is it so important? So, I mean, this is a map that Alistair has commissioned. The red areas are all areas where the wind speeds are above 7 meters per second. Each pixel on this map represents 2 to 3 gigawatts of potential. So if you take the map as a whole, and then you exploit 1% of it, that gives you 700 gigawatts of offshore wind. 700 gigawatts at 1%. And at the moment, globally, we're at 24 gigawatts. So the potential is absolutely, huge. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but it shows just the diversity and the potential of what's going to happen. And the dark red is for water depths of less than 50 meters. The pink is for water depths of up to 250 meters, which would have imply floating wind of some early stage floating wind. I'm not going to go into this, only to say that if you look at offshore wind as a percentage of the entire global wind market, it's grown now to 8.8% in 2018, according to the latest GWEC figures. We expect that to go to 20% of annual installations by 2030 just for offshore wind. So offshore wind is becoming, really a very significant and one of the most dynamic areas for growth in the wind sector as a whole. And why again? I mean, why is it successful? As David said in his first slide, one of the reasons why it's successful politically is that it creates a lot of jobs. So this is Germany. This line is new offshore wind capacity. And these are jobs that are created in manufacturing and in maintenance. You can see a pretty steady growth of jobs in offshore wind cluster, particularly in areas around places like Bremerhaven and places like that. So it's a pretty important industrial story. This is one from UK that just tries to show a correlation between installations. On the one hand, so we're just about 8.3 or 8.5 gigawatts now as of last week, I think, and the levelized cost of energy. So there's a very important, again, going back to this idea of a sector deal, there's a very important kind of relationship between the price of energy that we can provide to the market and the installations and the political acceptance, which then translates into more volume and a bigger industry and lower prices. So there's really a kind of virtuous circle that's established once the industry gets to a certain scale. Sorry, that's a repeated one. This one, David's already shown, I think. That's a Bloomberg one. Again, I mean, the drop in the levelized cost has been absolutely dramatic, as Thomas said in his opening remarks. And this is just comparing the offshore price reduction to the onshore price reduction. It's been pretty steady and impressive on onshore, but it's been even more dramatic in terms of offshore. So let's just quickly talk about what's kind of important. I mean, so it's legal certainty, and it's having a reliable process for environmental impact assessments and permitting, and it's really important that this permitting process is robust and that it's not something that is subject to a kind of veto from different interest groups. I mean, there needs to be a fair and robust process where people are listened to and reasonable objections are taken into account, but that doesn't mean that every stakeholder should have a veto. And I think that's really important because we found in every single country, and I'm not just talking about offshore here, in every single country there are people who object to wind power, there are also people who object to solar power, there are also people who object to nuclear power and to thermal power. There are people who object to, cutting the leaves off your tree in your garden or putting up a new shed in your back garden. There are people who object to you driving down the street in a certain way. So I mean, you're going to find people who are not happy with projects, but that doesn't mean that those people should have a veto. I think what's really important is that people are listened to and that reasonable objections are taken into account. I actually, before I worked at GWEC, I worked for FTI Consulting, and I spent 3 years advising on a bird issue for a large developer. It was actually four or 5 years and a 3-year legal process, basically talking about bird impacts, not based on any particular evidence. And the reason the legal challenge was able to occur was because the permitting process, it was a Scottish permitting process, had not been done, the consensus was it hadn't been done in the exact watertight way it needed to be done. And that's what opened the door to a legal challenge, which then caused a 3 or 4 year delay for a 500 megawatt project. So, getting this framework right, where people can have their say, but the decision can be made in a reasonable way, is absolutely fundamental. And that's one of the issues I think we've most discussed this week while I've been in Japan with ministry officials from different ministries, is the whole issue of what's taking stakeholder opinion into account and what's having a veto. And then grid availability, again, I mean, David spoke about, I mean, the system historically was based on utility control of the grid and also on first come, first serve. Large scale offshore wind can't work with that framework. You need to know that you can have a grid connection, and you need to know who's going to build it, and there needs to be a framework for financing it. So these are the kind of policy developments. I mean, we are extremely happy with the fact that the government has passed the new law. We think it's a very exciting and positive step forward, and we think the government's to be congratulated on that move. And we think the move towards designating zones is extremely kind of important and positive. And what we're seeing from our members and from the wind industry in general is that there's a lot of excitement, and people are coming to Japan and setting up offices. And we're seeing that from large international developers. And we're seeing that from a new group of Japanese developers who are very actively developing projects as well. And we're seeing turbine manufacturers also establishing a presence. So we think it's extremely positive kind of development here in the market. But let's go back to kind of what I guess my the areas that still need to be kind of talked about and discussed. I mean, I don't want to preempt a lot of this stuff because I know it's still being discussed by the committee, and I would like to. I had a very good meeting with Kaji-san, who sat over here this morning, and I know a lot of this stuff. I don't want to preempt what he's going to say, but I guess the important thing is to point out as the wind industry is we don't want extremely expensive wind projects. We don't want to have extremely high tariffs that create a massive gap between the Japanese market and the international market, and then don't actually produce projects. And this is what has happened a little bit. I mean, we've got an extremely attractive feed-in tariff, but the problem is not here the feed-in tariff. The problem is the ability to be able to go out and build and create volume. So what we want is, we want a big industry with big volumes, and we want to be able to bring this price down to international levels very, very quickly. And I'm very confident we can do that if we are allowed to access the market and access the grid and go out and compete. What we don't want is a very small industry with very high costs, because then other industries, like the fossil industry and the nuclear industry, will go to politicians and say, hey, offshore wind is extremely expensive and it doesn't do very much. So we don't want that outcome. So yes, we think that the establishment of feed-in tariffs at an attractive level are very important for the start-up of the market, and I fully agree. We need to build the first 2 or 3 gigawatts, but those prices need to be brought down very, very quickly. And then on the planning side, as I said, at the moment, what we don't want to do is have the example, follow the example of onshore wind, because in onshore wind, what's happened is the feed-in tariff is very attractive, but hardly anything has been built. And the permitting process has been 4 or 5 years for small onshore wind projects. So again, what we want is volume and clarity to be able to build and bring down the prices. So I'm going to conclude there, but in the coming kind of months and years, I think what you're going to see is that the industry here, our friends and partners in the JWPA and GWEC are going to put together a really serious proposal to government of the type that we've seen in the UK of a sector deal, where we can go to government and say, look, if you can let us go out and build and do these volumes, then we can bring the price down to these levels. And we can create these kind of jobs, and we can create this kind of investment. So I think that's the thing, is to come and really seize the moment. So I think we're at a crossroads. I think we've got a tremendous opportunity. I don't think it's too late for Japan. I think Japan can still be a leader because of its industrial strength and its financial strength and its skills and its knowledge. And I think floating offshore in particular is a hugely attractive opportunity for Japan. But the opportunity is now. It's not in 10 years' time. It's not in kind of 5 or 6 years' time. The opportunity is now, and it's a golden opportunity for Japan. And we at GWEC really want to help you to be able to seize that opportunity. Thank you very much.